Hey kids, it's one of those weeks when what I've got for you is an in-depth tactics video instead of a mech ranking video. And this time I wanted to look at positioning for mechs. I'm going to take a look at a couple of different formations that I think are very useful in a broad variety of situations. One of them for fire support and one of them for advancing. Now our first formation is a classic long-range gun line for if you have some fire support mechs, usually kind of slower, heavily armored mechs with long-range weapons that you want to use to lay down fire while your other mechs are doing the close-in fighting. So this is a formation for your sniper mechs, your long-range missile boats, those kind of things. So here we have a fire support gun line that's made up of a couple of my favorite fire support mechs, a Cyclops 11A and an Awesome 9Q. The first thing you'll notice about them that's pretty obvious is that they're up high. They're standing so that the mechs are on level 2 hills, which means they go up to level 4, so they can see over all of the level 3 terrain that we see here surrounding them. This means that they're going to ignore a lot of cover that enemy forces might have, including woods unless the woods are adjacent to or on the units, or unless the units are really high up. And it's also going to allow them to ignore partial cover unless the mechs with the partial cover are at least at the same elevation. You'll also notice that in the forward direction these two mechs have partial cover themselves. This is very nice, of course. It protects their legs. The legs on that Cyclops are not very strongly armored, and it makes it harder for them to be hit. It's just a nice position to have them in, at least during the period when enemy mechs, other enemy forces, are far away from them. Now a thing about your fire support gun line is that enemy fast forces are going to try to get back there to start attacking those fire support mechs. If that happens, you might end up in a situation where enemy mechs could get up onto the hill in front of these mechs, the one that's giving them partial cover, and then start kicking them in the head, which you do not want. So you want to be aware of when enemy fast forces, especially enemy fast jumping mechs, are getting close enough that they're within one turn of showing up right next to these mechs. And if they do get to that point, if enemy mechs especially get up to that point, you may want to move up onto those level 3 hills so that the enemy mechs can't jump or otherwise run up onto those level 3 hills to kick your mechs in the head. Another important thing to notice about this gunline formation is that the mechs are not right next to each other. This is important when you have mechs like these two that have weapons with minimum ranges. So you see, the Cyclops is far enough away from the Awesome that if it twists its torso, it can fire into the rear arc of the Awesome. That's good, because if somebody comes right up behind the Awesome, the Cyclops will need to provide fire to destroy those mechs that are trying to hit the Awesome from the rear. But equally important is the fact that the Cyclops is far enough away that its Gauss rifle's minimum range is not going to interfere with it shooting at targets that get behind the Awesome. So you want your mechs to be a little distance apart from each other if they have minimum range weapons. And similarly, you can see here that keeping the mechs separate by about 3 hexes lets the Awesome cover the rear of the Cyclops with its PPCs without its 3-hex minimum range interfering with its ability to do that. So if your gunline mechs have minimum range weapons, which they often will, you want to keep them a few hexes apart like this so they can cover each other. And as enemy mechs approach, you may want to tilt the Cyclops or the Awesome towards the other mech so that you can cover a bigger swath of that mech's rear arc in case enemy mechs get a few hexes behind your partner mech. So the gunline formation isn't rocket science. The first thing to remember is situational awareness. If enemy mechs are in a position where they can run up and kick you in the head, you want to get on top of your covering hills so that that's not possible. And then of course the second thing to keep in mind is you may need to leave a few hexes between the mechs so that their long-range weapons can cover each other. So the other formation that I wanted to talk about is a single file advancing formation, which is often really good to use with your trooper mechs or your brawler mechs, the ones that are going to be heading out ahead of those fire support mechs to get into hand-to-hand or close-range combat with your enemies. The nice thing about a single file advance is that it makes it relatively easy for your mechs to cover each other's rears. Especially in this case, you can see I have my kind of trooper backup bodyguard mech, my crab, covering the rear of my warhammer. How far apart do you want to space the mechs? Well, that depends on the movement of the enemy threats that are in the area. So you can see in this situation, I've placed the crab a couple of hexes behind the warhammer because the enemy stealth can jump into the rear of the warhammer. So then if it does that, the crab will be in a position to take advantage, fire into the rear or the side of the stealth. So it's kind of a protection for the warhammer. Now here's a little quiz question for you. What's the mistake that I made in setting up my line of advance? What's the thing that I wasn't thinking of when I was setting it up? Think about it and I'll answer that question at the end of the video. Another thing you'll notice about the position I've got myself into here is that there's actually a possibility for the stealth to jump into the left side of the warhammer and head kick it. That's a thing that actually is not such a bad move for me to do in this situation, because a thing to keep in mind about head kicks is that they're very tempting to go for, but they aren't always as effective as we think of them as being. The stealth is a 45-ton mech, so its kicks do 9 points of damage. If the warhammer's head is undamaged, which is what I'm assuming in this situation, the stealth's kick, it's going to do a point of damage to the pilot, but that's fine. You're not going to fail that 3+ consciousness check very often, and that 9 damage is not actually going to pierce the armor and get through the internal structure. So there's no risk of a critical on the head if the stealth kicks the warhammer in the head. There's just going to be that 1 point of damage to the pilot, which isn't so bad. And in this situation, it would actually be pretty nice for the stealth to end up right next to the warhammer in that left arc, because then the warhammer could torso twist and just blast the stealth with its short-range weapons. So it could then be collecting hits from both that warhammer's full arsenal as well as the crab. And even if the warhammer had taken a previous head hit, this might actually be a risk worth taking in a lot of situations, because the thing to keep in mind about head kicks is that they're just not always going to land. You know, much of the time you won't hit with the kick. And even if you do, there's only a 1 in 6 chance of hitting the head. So many players are very afraid of head kicks, and there's a reason for that. You shouldn't take a head kick risk, frivolously. But that said, head kicks are not always going to kill your mech, and you shouldn't be so risk averse about head kicks that you're not willing to risk them. You always feel like a dope dying to a head kick, but honestly, a lot of the time your opponent who goes for a head kick is going to be at a disadvantage for going for that, and the head kick just isn't going to land. So sometimes you want to use head kicks to lure your opponent. Everybody loves to land a head kick, and a lot of players will make a risky move that wouldn't actually be so beneficial to them on the off chance that they'll get a head kick in, like in this situation. I can tell you that if I was the player playing the stealth, I definitely would not go for the head kick here. Okay, so here's the answer to my little quiz question. A mistake that's easy to make when you have an enemy mech that has really fast jump movement is to always assume that their jump movement is the best way for them to get close to you. But actually in this situation, a thing you do need to keep in mind is that the stealth has mask, and so it actually is capable, as you can see here, of running all the way into the rear arc of the crab. So actually, I've kind of given my opponent an opening there, and I should have had the crab 1 hex further back. So aside from the specifics of the two formations that I've just talked about, I hope this video gives you a sense of some of the ins and outs, some of the complications that come into play in BattleTech when you're deciding about positioning and where to have your units end up at the end of your turn. It's been a while since I did a video about movement, but I hope that I'll have some more opportunities to do some more videos like this in the future, maybe discussing some more formations or more kind of positioning tricks for getting the most out of your unit's maneuverability.